Everyone. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Sam Fleming. I'm the Bureau Chief here in Brussels at the Financial Times, and it's an enormous pleasure to be at the EUUK Forum's annual conference and to have this conversation with Stefano Sannino, who's the Secretary General of the European External Action European External Action Service. It's a post that Stefano has held since January 1st of last year. Among his previous posts are Italian Ambassador to Spain and Permanent Representative of Italy to the EU. He's obviously enormously well placed to help us assess where the EU's relationship with its former member, the UK, is heading. We are evidently in a very stormy period when it comes to this relationship because of questions about the application of the protocol and the commitment of Boris Johnson's government to it. And at the same time, the war in Ukraine and the deep security cooperation that we are seeing continuing between the UK and its partners. So it's a mixed and complex picture. And maybe, Stefano, if I could start with that theme. How do you summarize the state of play between the EU and the UK right now? Excuse me, because as I say, on one hand, direct relations between the EU and the UK are incredibly difficult because of the protocol and the possibility the UK will shred its treaty obligations. And yet at the same time, cooperation on the security front seems to be very strong.
Good morning, everybody, and good to be with you, Sam. Actually, I think that you have summarized quite well the situation. We are still, unfortunately, in the middle of a storm as far as the relationship between EU and UK is concerned, and especially on the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Still, I think that the specific moments like the one that we are going through with the crisis that we are living, it is also very important to keep the sense of direction and to remember that not only have we been together for many years, but we continue to be allies in the context of NATO. We continue to be a very strong like-minded. We continue to be a very strong allies on the world scene, and hence the importance of, let's say, not only preserving, but also nurturing the relations when it comes to foreign policy, security, defense. Because, as I said, we share the same values, we share the same vision, we share the same sense of things, and that's what we are trying to do.
I should say to the audience, we would welcome your questions if you had any. Do feel free to type them in the chat box. Stefano, we saw the UK famously reject the idea of a defence and security treaty with the EU back in the beginnings of its negotiations over the TCA early 2020. To what extent do you think that decision has held back the relationship between the EU and the UK? How different would things be today, if at all, if that had actually happened?
Well, I mean, you know us. We like to have a sort of structured and well-framed relationship. So it's this is the DNA of the European Union. But that said, I think that the substance is there. We have tried to develop a very strong cooperation, and again, the Russian aggression against Ukraine has been an extremely important moment for us to keep on working together. And let's say, even if I may miss more structural framework, this does not impede that we can have a very strong and very solid and very structured relationship, even outside a negotiated framework. We have taken up very much the pragmatic approach, which is very dear to the UK. And so we have tried to cooperate on specific issues of common interest. But as I said before, the areas of common interest is very broad and very large. And that's, I think it's working fine.
Would you have given that verdict, say, last autumn? I mean, at what point did things I mean, I presume the trigger was obviously the realization there was a greater chance of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, although different countries came to that conclusion and put different levels of probability on it at different times. But at what point did you sense that the relationship was, on the security and defense now front, beginning to change, given when we think about the story last year, it was largely one of turbulence between the EU and the UK?
To be honest, I mean, even before the crisis started, I mean, it was one of my let's say first things to do when I arrived to settle the issue of our presence in London, the established agreement for our delegation in the UK, and let's say starting from there. We realized that there were many things that we had to talk about, and we had an interest to talk about and to try to get our acts together. And so we have started, as I said, a very pragmatic, but I hope fruitful for both sides cooperation. And then the crisis, and I'm speaking not when the crisis erupted, but well before, became much more dense, much more substantial. And we really exchanged a lot on perspective, on actions to take together. And then all the period of the imposition of sanctions, which has been also a moment where we have worked really hand in hand.
I mean, you mentioned sanctions. It was obviously the work on that sanctions package, the first package, and then the subsequent one started well before the final decision, or at least the final move by Russia to invade. It started last autumn. Where we saw really early on from last autumn an extraordinary degree of cooperation between the EU and the US on sanctions policy. It was very joined up. Was the degree of cooperation equal with the EU and the UK at that time, or was the UK more following the lead of the other two partners? How did that dynamic develop between the three?
I think that it was a joint operation. It is true that the cooperation with the US was particularly strong. We really came from, let's say, approaches that had to be reconciled in order to make sure that we're on the same page. We were trying to make it clear that for us the point of secondary sanctions was a very sensitive political issue, and so we had in a way to work very closely with the US in order to align our positions. But then, I mean, very rapidly the cooperation became much broader, and certainly UK was very much part of this process.
One thing we do see, obviously, the parties, the EU, UK, and US, and indeed their other allies that have been in lockstep with them on sanctions, have not implemented by any means identical sanctions. They have quite different regimes. There are differences which create an unlevel playing field in some ways, especially if you're a multinational trying to comply with the sanctions regime. Is there more that could be done between the different players here to ensure that there's more evenness in the application and the nature of those sanctions to make it easier for big entities to comply with them?
Again, if I look at the way we have developed the cooperation on sanctions, at least, I mean, in the context of the G7, this has been extremely strong and close cooperation. We needed, as you say, to ensure that the playing field was even for everybody, and we have tried to work very closely in order to ensure this process. And I have to say that this is true on sanctions, but it is true also in other areas. Since you were mentioning US and triangular cooperation, I came to my mind immediately, for example, cybersecurity, cyber attacks, and the attribution of the cyber attacks, which we did together in a very cooperative and synchronized way.
let me just continue with the theme of sanctions for a little bit longer and ask you about the G7, which happened in Bavaria just a few days ago. Coming out of that was a joint commitment by G7 partners and the EU to explore the idea of a ceiling or a cap on the oil price, or the Russian oil price, I should add. Very difficult to actually make that happen. But clearly, at least a commitment to explore it. I just wondered, how soon we could see, if at all, this scheme reaching fruition, and what do you see as the main challenges?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, what needs to be said is that the idea of capping the price is a very good one, in the sense that it's a way of preserving our capacities in our countries, but at the same time not feeding the speculation process that Russia has started. And by the way, it has started well before the aggression took place. So the idea in itself is a good one. The main challenge for it to be effective is the universality of the mechanism, in the sense that you would need all countries of the world taking part in this mechanism. Now, it is true that when it comes to gas, pipelines are flowing gas towards Europe, and so in a way it is true that Russia is almost a monopoly, but it's also true that the European Union is almost a monopoly in terms of receiving gas. So from that point of view, this can be explored. When it comes to other ways of doing it, so for example, seaborne oil, and putting a cap either on the price or on insurance or on transport, then there again you need to be sure that you do not have distortion of trade, and then the only thing that is happening is that essentially oil goes to other places with other carriers and insured by other companies, and so the price remains the same, and then all the business which is linked to it collapses. So the question is how to find a sort of balance between all these elements. That's why it is important that it's made by the G7 countries, but beyond the G7 countries, and that there is a very clear global understanding that this is going to be the case. And that's why it was interesting that even in the context of the G7, there was a reach out to a number of other countries. And I think it will be important also to understand in the context of the G20 what is going to happen, even if we don't know if we can count on the presence of President Putin in the G20.
Part of what we were talking about unity and on the sanctions policy, but part of what underpinned that push for an oil price cap was actually a sense of a difference between how the US viewed the European oil embargo and how the EU viewed it. The US has clearly been more concerned that the way the sanctions were working would drive up the global oil price, and that seems to be what's happening. So do you look back at the sixth package and wonder whether we may have, in pushing this embargo, ended up hurting ourselves in Europe by pushing up the price so rapidly?
I don't think so. As I said, I mean, the speculation on hydrocarbons, on oil and gas, had started well before the war. This was something that Putin's Russia had started doing already months before the invasion. And the idea was exactly that of ensuring more resources and more revenues for Russia, and at the same time making us paying much more, and this feeding in inflation and the problems that we are facing now from the economic point of view. So I do not think that sanctions have generated the problem. they may have created an additional burden, but essentially, and I don't want to go into the narrative that we are trying to push very much, it is not the sanctions that have created the problem, it's the war that has created the problem. Sanctions are a consequence of the war, but the war in itself has disrupted trade flows, has disrupted price mechanisms, and hence it is much more difficult now to face these elements together while keeping the pressure with sanctions.
A reminder to the audience, if you did have questions for Stefano Sannino, the Secretary General of the EEAS, please do type them in the chat box. We have a couple of them already, which I'll get to in a minute. Before I do, let me just turn, Stefano, briefly to more directly the UK-EU relationship and the difficulties it's now in. Leaving aside the security side we've been talking about, the arrival of Liz Truss was greeted with some relief, I think, in Brussels initially, given how difficult relations have become with David Frost. And yet the mood, as I said, has now got rather darker because of the UK's apparent determination to override the protocol and legislation. Do you sense, how do you assess the state of affairs here? How worried are you about how turbulent things have got? And is it spilling over and affecting the security and defense cooperation at the same time?
Well, I think that there is no many more that I can say concerning the worries and preoccupations that the EU has when it comes to the relations with the UK. The Vice President of the Commission, Šefčovič, who is in charge of this file, has said it very clearly and in a very clear way. I think, and I cannot repeat that the main thrust, we do want to have a constructive, solid relationship with UK, but it is also true that this is a two-way street. Not enough that just one side wants it if the other is not playing ball alongside. It is also clear that the overall tonality of the relation has an impact on the whole of the relationship. So I cannot pretend that the difficulties that we are facing in other areas is not having an impact also on the external dimension of our relationship. That said, and that's what we are trying to do, we are trying to work constructively and cooperatively in areas which are of common interest, where we both believe that we have to get along constructively. And this is the good part of the story. I think that we have a very large spectrum of issues and of files of common interest where we need to work together. And again, what we have spoken up until now, Russia, the relation with Russia, and the broader sense of the security spectrum in the EU and beyond, the relationship with the United States, the relationship between EU and NATO, which is another very important part of the story, where UK is a very constructive partner. And I can mention much more to say that we are trying to, again, to build, not only preserve, but also build a constructive relationship, regardless of the, let's say, the more turbulent spectrum of the EU-UK relations.
The EU is clearly trying to develop in the realm of strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy, whatever we want to call it, the importance of it as a defense actor as well, the EU itself. Something that we saw obviously in the strategic compass and so on. So it's not only about NATO, but also about the EU developing itself in the defense arena, be it through more harmonization in procurement and weapons platforms and so on, or indeed in operations as well. Do you see that? How do you see that moving? And do you see the UK being willing to engage with the EU as its partner in defense beyond the realm of sanctions?
The second question is relatively easy, and the answer is yes. And there is an engagement, and we are working already together, and we are trying to, again, in a very pragmatic way, move ahead our common agenda. First one about the role in defense and security. The basic assumption is correct. I mean, we want to play a greater role, but I would like to frame it slightly differently because that's, I would say, how it is. It almost seems that essentially defense and security is a sort of static concept, and essentially that was covered by NATO, and now EU wants to enter into this process. And this is not the case. I mean, defense and security has become much broader as a concept. We have seen that on one hand we have, and unfortunately the Russian aggression is showing is we still have very conventional type of attacks that we have to face, and this is obliging all of us to be much more engaged in this area, including from the budget point of view. So we need to spend more and we need to spend better, what we're saying about joint procurement, but about rationalizing the way we produce and the way we behave as armies within the European Union. And this is one part of the story. And then another important element of this story is that what we are trying to do in terms of European defense is creating a set of forces which is interoperable and that can be used both as NATO assets and as EU assets. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story, that the security and defense has become a much broader concept. First of all, because you have more areas of operation, you have many different kinds of crises. You may have, I don't know, exfiltrations of civilians following a specific crisis in a country. You need to support your people on the ground because we have a mission that we are developing. You may have some terrorist attacks in a certain region. So, I mean, there are different kinds of crises that are not necessarily covered by NATO, and hence the European Union is trying to give itself the instrument to be able to intervene in this crisis. And then the third element, which is also needs to be taken into account, is the fact that the concept is become defense security has become a much broader context because we have many more elements that are coming into the picture: hybrid threats, cyber security, disinformation, outer space, number of issues that before were not part of the defense doctrine and that we need to work on. And as a matter of fact, the European Union, for his character, has been quite active in a number of these issues, and that wants to bring also this to the table. So once again, it's not the question that EU wants to crowd out elements which are already in NATO. We want to complement, we want to be part of this process, and we want to do other things that NATO cannot do or is not able to do at this stage.
Just one question about the trio again, the EU, the UK, and the US. In the past, several years ago at least, you might say, the UK liked to cast itself in the role of almost a bridge between the EU and the US, of first port of call. It's obviously now in a situation where, while on security, there is again deep cooperation with the US. The US, many policymakers in the US have been quite dismayed by the direction of affairs when it comes to the protocol. How do you see the UK's role in this trio again changing at all over the past, let's say, 5 years? How has it evolved, and is it a less important player in that trio as a result of Brexit?
I mean, I don't know if we can speak about a trio. I mean, once again, I'm sorry to say this so bluntly, but I mean, the relationship with US does not go through London. I mean, the relation between EU and US is strong and solid, and I mean, it's a direct and bilateral relationship. We don't need go-between to talk to Washington. So what we do and what we are doing and we want to do is to keep on developing relationships which are multilateral, and in the sense that this is a multilateral scheme where we work with US, with UK, but also with Japan or with Korea or with Australia, and we want to work with a number of players that have let's say, a sort of common vision of the world. And I think that it's important that this relationship is constructive and positive from all points of view and from all angles. Unfortunately, the polarization that we are seeing in this situation has generated a situation in which Russia has become a very strong adversary and is playing its game. All the countries that I was mentioning are getting together much more, and we see that there is a sense of unity. What was happening yesterday in Madrid with the enlargement of NATO to Finland and Sweden is part of this story. And then in the middle, and I think that's an important part of the story, there are a number of countries which are not necessarily on one side or the other. And they are trying to preserve a sort of balance between these two. And that's where we need to focus our attention on and to try to see how we can work constructively together with these countries. Because and I'm thinking now especially to Africa, this is becoming really a sort of swinging point, swinging continent in the way they are approaching this crisis and the way they are relating to us and to Russia.
Question from the audience. This is from Pedro Miguel Rodriguez Duarte, who's from the Portuguese permanent rep here in the EU. It's about the UK and the notion of a European political cooperation forum or some sort of political unity. We've had ideas from Emmanuel Macron and also Charles Michel on a broader constellation of countries. Boris Johnson jumped in this week and suggested maybe this should also include Turkey and North Africa. The question is, do you see the UK as a member or a willing member of such a forum?
Potentially, yes. I mean, I think that it's if UK is interested in being part of this forum, I think that potentially it would be absolutely an important part of this community. This process, because somehow, as you said, both Macron and Michel put on the table some idea, and there was a first discussion among leaders at the last European Council. We need to define much better, I think, the scope of this community. The broad idea is that between membership and being a third country, you may have a number of sort of intermediate step, which is a space where you share a number of things. And then you can decide that this space is a transition towards membership, or it's a space where you want to stay and you will continue to stay because you don't want to join the European Union, but you want to share some of the policies of the European Union. And more broadly, the political sense of the European Union. So I think that we need to first really to define which is the content, and then once we have well defined the content, we need to see also which is the geographic scope. There were different opinions of having based more on principle, more on the strictly geographic criterion, a broader geographic criterion. So there are many, many options that are still on the table, and I think that we have not yet come out to a final definition of how this is going to work. But let's say if there is one element which is common to all these reflections, is the fact that potentially UK should be an important part of this process.
And do you see the comments from Boris Johnson about this as a positive sign in that direction? I mean, have you had any conversations with your British counterparts to gauge whether there's serious appetite about this?
Not yet, to be honest. We have more had a sort of internal reflection within the European Union, and again, we need to come up with more solid ground, especially when it comes to the definition of the content.
One, just to look back and then use that to look forward when it comes to the crisis itself and the invasion of Ukraine. The UK and the US were fairly early in suggesting that they believe this is a serious threat, and there were some EU member states which were more skeptical as to whether this was actually going to happen. Can you talk a little bit about why different countries were drawing such different conclusions from intelligence that they were sharing between each other?
It's that will remain a big mystery in a way, and it is true. I mean, somehow it was very. I mean, I think that the data, I mean, the information that we had gathered was very much the same, but then the conclusions were not necessarily the same. Maybe because there was still a little more faith, let's say, in continental Europe about the, let's say, the rationality of the Russian system. I don't know. I mean, that's the, as I said, in this case, it's difficult to say because it's much a question of political appreciation. But you are right in saying this. We have been till the last moment, let's say, almost unwilling to believe that Putin would have gone that way.
And the current situation, you do see some attempt in the UK to portray itself as being at the vanguard of the effort to help Ukraine, to train troops and that sort of thing, and some suggestion that other European countries have not done enough. How do you view that debate? Presumably with some frustration, but do you think there's any truth in it?
I mean, honestly, this is if you want, it's a little bit part of the. Which I think is part of nature and politics of the beauty contest. You want to prove that, especially in these cases, and especially with the country like Ukraine, which is under attack, and it is, let's say, generating a lot of sympathy of who is the one who has done most for to help them. Maybe I've worked too many years in this field to think that you can fight this. I think that what is important for me that we really support and help Ukraine. I think that we have done what we had to do at the right moment. Remember that at the beginning, when NATO was rather, let's say, focused on strengthening the eastern flank of the alliance, it was more the European Union that was supporting Ukraine, also militarily. I mean, if you look at in terms of ratio per capita, if I'm not wrong, now I'm going, it's Estonia, which is the country that has been more supportive of Ukraine. But again, as a whole, the European Union has done a good job in communitarizing the decision of supporting militarily Ukraine. We have taken a very strong decision with the granting the candidate status to Ukraine at the last European Council, so making the European perspective very concrete. And I can assure you that the discussion at the European Council was very substantial. It was not, let's say, just a vague political perspective. So I think that we have done what we needed to do in terms of supporting Ukraine financially, politically, and militarily. And it's very good that UK is doing the same, and it's very good that US is doing the same, that Japan is doing the same. Then, I mean, I leave to the politicians the beauty contest.
I only have a couple of minutes, but I'm going to use it to take one last question from the audience. And this one is about EU-UK cooperation in research, which is obviously relevant in the context of security as well, as we've been talking about this. I think question is a reference to Horizon. What about EU-UK cooperation in research? It looks like the simple technical question, but such an important thing and stuck in political limbo. What are the implications of this? I'm sorry, we only have a couple of minutes on it, but it is an important topic.
No, I understand, but this is part of, I mean, Horizon is much more the scientific cooperation in the civilian area. So it's not the security or defense side. And unfortunately, this is part of the overall blockage that has been generated by these latest events concerning the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think that our cooperation, and I've said it's the beginning and I will end on the same note, our cooperation is moving pragmatically in a constructive way, and we will try to preserve this. I think that it is important that we are not losing this dimension and this perspective.
That's a positive note to end on. Thank you very much indeed, Stefano Sannino, Secretary General of the EEAS. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. So I'm now going to hand things over to our next panel. That is a conversation between Nathalie Loiseau, Sir Oliver Heald. They're speaking to Georgina Wright. So please do stay with us. Thanks very much.
Bye. Bye-bye.